Hello again. Hopefully the first lecture wasn't too traumatic. I wanted to provide a big overview of major botanical concepts, but I think the next three presentations will be shorter and more practical and applicable to plant identification. So in this second lecture, I want to provide information more about plant anatomy and the variation in plant morphologies and some of the terms that are important pertaining to vegetative structures, that is to say, stems, leaves, and roots. The next lecture will focus on reproductive structures. So again, I don't want to induce PTSD from 10th grade, but just a broad overview of cell structures. And the internal structure of plant cells, it has many similar components that you would find in animal or fungal cells. There's a nucleus where DNA is stored. Genes get expressed as proteins that get modified in some other components of the cell called the ER. They get transported around the cell with microtubules and the Golgi bodies. And those proteins either do their thing inside the cell cytoplasm or get expressed on the membrane of the cell to control export and import of different molecules. There are a few things that are different about plant cells, though. One is that they contain chloroplast, obviously. Animals don't contain chloroplast. Chloroplasts are where photosynthesis takes place. Plant cells also have a component called a vacuole, which is essentially a secondary lipid enclosed sac inside the cell. And for most plants, this is where secondary metabolites are stored. So that can be waste products, or there are from metabolism, or there are specific chemicals that are made and stored there that do things like deter herbivory or protect against fungal infection, or maybe serve other functions. Plants, unlike animals, also have cell walls. Animals, plants, and fungi all have cell membranes, but animals are the only group that lacks cell walls. Fungal cell walls are made of a substance called chitin, while plant cell walls are made of a combination of cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, pectins, and a few other ancillary compounds. Most of the carbon in plants is stored as cellulose, though. That's the primary constituent of plant cell walls. Lignin is the substance that makes tissue much stronger, harder, giving it a kind of woody texture. So there's lots of lignin, for example, laid down in xylem cells, which are dead at maturity. And even some herbaceous plants will start to lignify, even if they don't normally produce classical wood in secondary growth. So plants overall have relatively simple anatomy, but very complex morphologies, meaning that the different forms their tissues can take, or rather the different ways their organs can develop for morphology can vary quite a bit, but their tissue systems are pretty simple. So whereas, say, animals have many kinds of tissue, we have nerve tissue, we have epithelial cells, we've got muscle tissue, intestinal tissue, epidermal tissue, all these different kinds of tissues. And many of those tissues also have a complex extracellular matrix that gives them interesting properties. But plants just have more or less three types of tissue systems. Ground tissue, which is what makes up most of the plant body. Dermal tissue, which is mostly the outer skin type cells, outer layer of cells that protect the plant. And vascular tissue systems, meaning the cells that make up the vessels that transport food and water. So we'll look a little bit about each of these cell types too in a moment, but in the ground tissue systems, we have basically three cell types. Most of those ground tissues are made up of parenchyma, and there are two kinds of specialized cells called collenchyma and sclerenchyma. Dermal cells mostly consist of the epidermis, so that outer layer on leaves and on stems that helps protect the internal tissue. And it also includes the cells that form special structures on the epidermis. So cells that open and close to allow carbon dioxide in and water out, or specialized hairs, etc. And there are two kinds of vascular, two types of vessels. Xylem transports water, and phloem cells transport uh, uh, the substances made in photosynthesis, so starches and sugars. And the vascular cambium is the layer of cells that makes new xylem and makes new phloem. And to give you an idea of what this could include, here's a cross section of a leaf. So you take a leaf like my hand, cut it this way or this way, and you're looking on the side. So you see the leaf itself is sort of structured like a sandwich. You've got epidermal cells on the top and on the bottom. And then in the middle, soft gooey center, are a bunch of parenchyma cells. A lot of them are responsible for different aspects of photosynthesis. So that's ground tissue. So epidermal tissue, ground tissue. And you can see some of the vessels here too. Let's see, yeah, right here. So here's this is a vein coming through the leaf. So that would include vascular tissue like xylem and phloem. So looking at ground tissues first, the parenchyma cells are by far the most common cells in plants and within the ground tissue system. Most of a plant's body is made up of ground tissue parenchyma cells. So those are making up most of what you see inside of a leaf, most of what you see inside of a stem, most of what makes up root cells, most of what makes up all the different parts of a flower tend to be made of primarily parenchyma and to a lesser extent epidermal cells. So these are responsible for photosynthesis, for structure, for storage, etc. And then parenchyma cells are an extra type, a cell type that provides extra strength and flexibility for plant parts, and they're especially common in the petioles of leaves. So those stem-like structures that attach the leaf blade to the rest of the plant and provide the ability of the leaf to stay rigid. So parenchyma cells specifically provide flexible support rather than rigid support, as we'll see with sclerenchyma, but they tend to have a kind of coiled, a different way, a particular way that the cell walls lay down in the cell, which is kind of long and thin, is a bit coiled to provide that flexibility along with some strength. This is a cross section of a celery petiole. So when you eat celery, you're eating part of the petiole. And if you break a celery stick and from this top part down and slightly pull it apart, you'll see thin strings. Those are examples of parenchyma cells, and they've just been overexpressed in celery because we bred them that way. And then sclerenchyma cells provide really rigid support, and they have extra thick secondary cell walls, so extra layers of lignin and cellulose. And they can exist in two forms, in a fibrous form, meaning a long and thin form, or in a smaller globular or kind of star-shaped forms called sclerids. And the jute fibers, the jute fibers, the fibers, this is an example of fibers seen in jute, provide a lot of additional rigidity that you wouldn't be able to get with parenchyma cells. And then in other tissues that have really hard parts, like say the seed coat, the outer part of it and the hard part of the seed consists of a lot of sclerenchyma cells. And even kind of interestingly, the gritty texture you get when eating a pear is actually scattered kind of star-shaped sclerenchyma cells like you see here. Dermal tissues consist of cells that form the outer and protective tissues of the plant body. So it's a rather complex tissue type in that the different cells can take dramatically different forms. Often they secrete wax that forms the cuticle that again helps to seal in moisture. This is a close-up image that we'll look at more later, but a close-up image of the top or the bottom of a leaf. And you can see the epidermal cells are tightly packed against each other, and there's lots of surface area contact with a bunch of sealant material, essentially, kind of like puzzle pieces, and all of those act to try to make sure moisture stays in. But epidermal cells don't just consist of or the dermal tissue system doesn't just consist of epidermal cells. It also consists of stomata and guard cells. These are, again, the pores that open and close to let carbon dioxide in, and from which water can evaporate out for transpiration and the ability of the plant to draw in water from the soil. Dermal tissue system also includes hairs. This is an example of a glandular hair. So this is a several cell extension. It's like probably 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5, 3 or 4, 3 to 5 cells high. And it's a glandular because the topmost cell is full of oils that are meant to be usually to have some sort of anti-herbivory effect, so to deter herbivores from eating it. However, in some species, we are really fond of those glandular hairs. So if this is something from like something in the mint family, it's the rupturing of these glandular hairs that releases those aromatic compounds that we find pleasurable. The vascular tissue system consists of two main types of cells, xylem cells and phloem cells. Xylem cells are what transport water. The cells themselves are dead at maturity. So the cells will grow, divide, grow, differentiate, and then die. And what's left is like a hard tube or tube-ish, a long, at least hollow cell. In some types of xylem cells, called tracheary elements, they're more pipe-like. So it's like, imagine just pipe pieces or PVC pieces stacked on top of each other. More commonly, especially an exclusive, and the only cell type in ferns and gymnosperms, are these longer, thinner tracheids. And tracheids don't function quite like pipes. Instead, imagine they have a bunch of holes kind of scattered throughout, but not at the tips, but they kind of wrap around each other. So water moves from tracheid cell to tracheid cell kind of tortuously, but it still gets the job done quite well. We'll learn later about how this mechanism works, but it's not capillary action. It's through negative hydrostatic pressure from transpiration. But essentially, they're dead, hollow cells that are just for transporting water up one way. The phloem cells, in contrast, are not dead at maturity, but they're so specialized for transporting food that they often have neighboring cells called companion cells that help provide some of the support function for keeping the cells alive. The main phloem cells are called sieve tube elements, and they're so specialized at moving sugars and starches from cell to cell. They need that companion cell support. So they're live at maturity, and then sugars can be transported from where they're made to where they're needed, or from where they're stored to where they're needed, so they can go in any direction. Whereas water more or less goes only one way, from more negative to less negative hydrostatic pressure. And here's just more of how these three different tissue systems can be distributed in different plant organs. So here's a cross-section of a leaf. And you can see that the epidermal cells are depicted in black here. The main ground tissue cells described as mesophyll cells are depicted in green. And then the xylem and phloem cells, or the vascular tissue systems, are depicted in red and blue, with the red representing xylem and the blue representing phloem in this case. Here's a cross-section of a typical stem of a dicot plant. There's, again, the outer epidermal cells, the kind of green beige color, which, depending on your screen, is the ground tissue. And then the vascular system is grouped together in bundles. And in the case of the stem, it is in dicots anyway, it's arranged in a ring, which enables the stem to grow wider or grow in girth. And here's a cross-section of a typical young root. They have an extra layer internally called the periderm, which depicted in black here, which in part controls, serves as a mechanism to be able to sort of filter water and other compounds that go into the main root. And instead of in a circular array of bundles, the xylem occur in a cross pattern with phloem cells in between the cross sections. And as they grow, it does end up essentially growing into an inner and outer ring, or an outer ring and a red circular pattern. But anyway, so just to give you kind of idea of how these tissue systems seem to be distributed in different plant parts. Here's the whole plant body, and there are some terms that to be just aware of as we describe some of these subsequent parts. But typically the plant body consists of a shoot that transitions to the root at the root crown. The internal anatomy of the stem and root are quite different, which is interesting, but the root serves to anchor the plant in the soil, and as the roots, secondary roots grow, they help draw in water and draw in nutrients that are dissolved in that water. The shoot provides vertical support for the plant above ground, and the tip of the shoot grows from the shoot apex, and the tip of the root grows from the root apical meristem. In the shoot apex, though, there is a particular and regular pattern for how it grows that will vary somewhat based on the arrangement of the leaves. But essentially, at the very, very tippy tip of the root of the shoot tip, or the apex, is the shoot apical meristem. That is a region where cells are rapidly dividing. And then they start to differentiate in the precursors to the organs that they'll eventually grow into. So if you imagine as this shoot tip is growing up, this is the primordial leaf. These are the primordial leaves, and these are the primordial buds. We'll learn later that at the base of each leaf is a bud. But this enables, though, as the shoot keeps growing up, the distances between the nodes, the internodal space between the leaves tends to increase in length, and you get this regular repeating pattern of leaf arrangement. We'll learn that some plants have, alternating leaves. Some have leaves opposite each other. Some have more than 2 leaves in any one spot, but the same pattern still applies. From these bud primordia, the bud primordia will mature into buds on the side, and when they're on this side, they're called axillary buds, and then the leaf primordia will mature into a true leaf. So these axillary buds, and the name axillary comes from axil, A-X-I-L, which is to describe the space between the petiole of the leaf here and the main stem. So sort of like an upside down armpit. Isn't that a nice visual? But so that's the axil, and an axillary bud can grow into a new stem called a lateral branch, and that lateral branch will have the same pattern as the main stem, where you have a shoot apical meristem with a repeating pattern of dividing and differentiating cells in a regular pattern. And each of the leaves on the lateral branch will also have a bud, and that pattern can keep repeating. So in that sense, the growth pattern of plants is both open and indeterminate, unlike, say, animals, where we have a closed indeterminate growth pattern. We will stop maturing, will stop growing at a certain point. Most perennial plants can keep growing, woody plants can. Because of the complexity of our tissue systems, we have a very limited way about which we can be arranged. Most of the time, we have a head, 2 arms, 2 legs in a certain position. We've all probably met people where their digestive tract seems to be inverted, and you know what I mean. But generally, we have this pretty fixed pattern, and if that pattern is diverged from, we don't function as well. Plants, though, can have all sorts of patterns. So there's a reason why 2 white oaks never look the same. It's because different lateral branches have had different environmental influences that determine where and how they grow to seek sunlight or have been, say, chewed on by other by herbivores or something. All that can influence how the ultimate structure of the tree grows, right? Other terms, I think that's it. Yeah, at any point where a leaf intersects the stem is called a node, and the space in between a given node is called an internode, so the between nodes. And that's helpful later for understanding leaf arrangement. Oh, wait, I have more. Okay, so this depicts a similar idea where there is, at each node, there's a bud and a leaf, and between two nodes is internodal space. So another way to break this down is you can see that each of these nodes forms a repeating unit called a phytomere. And that repeating unit will hold and repeat itself in the axillary buds. Not all plants have really visible stems. If it does have a true stem, it's said to be caulescent. That comes from the Latin word for stem. But some plants have what's called a basal rosette. So they're said to be acaulescent, lacking a stem. What's actually happened is on acaulescent plants with basal rosettes, the internodal space is very short. So it seems as if all the leaves are growing kind of on top of each other at the base. And then they may still produce a inflorescence or a stalk of flowers, but that's different than a true stem. The advantage here is that often this pattern is selected for in plants that are grazed on. So if all the leaves are low growing close to the ground, it's less likely that a grazing animal or a human with a lawnmower can decapitate it or get rid of all of its leaves. So that's why you often with these early succession and what in our context we call weedy species tend to have these basal rosettes. All right, so we're going to now go into the general structure and the variation of each of the major vegetative organs, so leaves, stems, and roots, with a lot of emphasis on leaves because they're the most variable and complex in many ways. So a leaf has two primary functions for photosynthesis and for transpiration. So photosynthesis, again, consists of itself of two parts, absorbing light. So the leaf blade is like a solar panel to absorb the energy of light. And then that energy of light is used to convert carbon dioxide into more complex carbon compounds. So the carbon dioxide enters the leaves as well through these pores that can open and close called stomata. And then whenever the pores are open and carbon dioxide is entering, when there's lots of energy hitting the leaf, that can heat up water to the point of vaporization. So water can actually evaporate out of these open pores. That is the underlying mechanism for transpiration, which is the movement of water into plants, which we'll cover when we talk about stems later. So at any given point, a plant has to regulate how much carbon dioxide enters the plant versus water leaving the plant. And maybe not to leave you hanging, I'll give you a preview. So to finish that thought on transpiration, when water is evaporated out of a leaf because of the sticky properties of water molecules, they tend to attract other water molecules to them. So if there's water evaporating out, it's going to pull along the next water molecule, which then gets evaporated out of the stomata, which then pulls along another neighboring molecule. And that chain reaction of dragging neighboring water molecules as they're evaporated away extends to the leaf, it extends to the petiole, it extends to the stem, it extends to the branches, it extends to the trunk, through the roots, and to the soil. So that evaporation out of water out of the leaf is what essentially pulls, through negative pressure, water into the plant from the soil, into the roots, up the stem, and out the leaves. All right, so on leaf anatomy itself, the main part of the leaf that you might recognize is the flat part. That's the solar panel part called the blade. But that's not the only part of the leaf. The blade is the leaf also consists of the petiole, which attaches the blade to the stem. The petiole extends into the leaf blade as the midrib or the primary vein, and then that often branches off into secondary or tertiary veins. And in some cases, the pattern of the veins can help with identification. So some plants that have these net-like venation, like in dicots, you might have the secondary veins that are very conspicuous and go all the way to the tip. Other times they curve back towards the top. Other times they connect with each other in loop-like patterns, etc. And as I mentioned in grasses, instead you have many secondary veins that are parallel to each other rather than this branching pattern. At the base of every leaf, or depending on your orientation, it could be the top of the base of the leaves, like in here, is a bud. The bud can grow, it can be vegetative, so it can grow into a new stem, right? A new lateral branch with new leaves and new buds. Or it could be reproductive, so it could be a larger, usually flower buds are larger, that turns into a flower, and then the flower will turn into a fruit once pollinated and fertilized. Some leaves have structures called stipules at their base. That is a kind of silly term, but it describes any paired appendage at the base of a leaf. And they can be helpful for identification sometimes. Their presence or absence, and then their appearance. So sometimes stipules have a leaf-like shape or a blade-like shape. And so they might have, some very minor role in photosynthesis. In other cases, stipules can occur as spines for defense. In other cases, they can be glands for, say, releasing nectar, or for also for defensive purposes. Or they could be hairs, which can have sometimes a defensive property or a light-reflecting property. But anyway, the presence or absence in the form the stipules take can sometimes help you with some identification. For example, many plants in the rose family tend to have leafy stipules, is one idea, but not always, and not exclusively. Here's just another, just for comparison, another image of a leaf structure that show many of the same components, but here's the stem, here are the paired appendages called the stipules. At the base of a petiole is a bud, and then here's the leaf blade with veins. There are a few other things labeled on this diagram though that I like. One, some leaves have something called pulvini, and they can be on the lower end of the petiole, the upper end, and those just some plants have those to help with manipulating the position of the leaf. So there are kind of swollen areas that can, depending on their configuration, can cause the leaf to move, essentially. It's kind of like a joint. And many plants in the bean family, the Fabaceae, can have a pulvinus that is conspicuous. Other terms to be aware of is that the top, what we call the top of the leaf, or the side of the leaf that faces the stem, is called the adaxial surface. The bottom of the leaf, or the side of the leaf away from the stem, is called the abaxial surface with a B. My mnemonic device would be B for bottom. That helps. And so you might come across descriptions or keys of plants that say, like, I don't know, abaxial surface, tomentose and copper colored, or something like that. That was to say that the bottom side of the leaf has hairs on it and is brown in color. So, it would be too easy if we just said the upper or lower side of the leaf. So we have to have fancy terms. But in reality, these surfaces are meant to provide clarity, because leaves can be in all sorts of positions. But ultimately, we're talking about what would the adaxial surface? Where's the adaxial surface as the leaf is coming out of the bud? It's always the side that developmentally is going to be facing closer to the stem, for example. And then the edge of the leaf is not called the edge. Again, that would be too easy. It's called the margin. And the tip of the leaf is also not called the tip. It's called the apex. And the base of a leaf, though, rationally is called the base. A few other Ancillary terms to be aware of. Most leaves have obvious petioles, so they're said to be petiolate. And most flowers have a similar structure called a pedicel. So it's that little stemmy-like structure that attaches the flower to the rest of the stem. So if those are obvious, it's said to be pedicellate. But if the petiole or the pedicel is so short that that the leaf or the flower seems to be attached directly to the stem, it is described as being sessile. And some plants also have their petioles that effectively wrap around the stem in a formation called the leaf sheath. So the presence or absence of that can also sometimes be helpful. What comes to mind immediately might be the grasses have sheathing leaves. If you notice, they have a stem called a culm, and the leaf blade graduates into the petiole that wraps around the stem. So check that out the next time you look at a grass, especially a large one, where it's more obvious. Internally, the leaves have specific orientations and structures that may be of interest. So here's the same cross section I showed you earlier of a leaf. So again, you're taking a leaf like my hand and cutting it this way. Or realistically, it could also be this way, but side profile of the leaf essentially. And again, there's a kind of a sandwich effect. There's an epidermal layer on top, the adaxial surface, and an epidermal layer on the bottom. In between is the ground tissue, but specifically the mesophyll. Meso means middle, and phyll means leaf. So collectively the mesophyll. And there are two types of mesophyll, which are both parenchyma cells, but it's sometimes called the palisade parenchyma or the palisade mesophyll or the spongy parenchyma or this spongy mesophyll. Notice on the top side of the leaf, the mesophyll cells are vertical. Palisade means columnar, so kind of columnar shaped and stacked very closely. These cells will have lots and lots of chloroplast in them. And the idea is that if this is the side of the leaf that is facing the sun, you can intercept as much light as possible. On the underside of the leaf, there tends to be a higher concentration of stomata. So stoma is the whole structure is stomata, is a stomate. And then here are the two guard cells. And that makes sense too, right? If the sun is hitting here, you want the holes where water could evaporate out of to be less exposed. So they tend to be on the bottom of the leaf. But this is not only where water evaporates, as I mentioned, this is where carbon dioxide enters. So the lower half of the leaf tends to have a spongy structure. So the cells are more scattered in appearance. There's lots of air space in between, and that is to encourage diffusion of carbon dioxide. That way, all the cells that are intercepting light also get carbon dioxide to undergo photosynthesis. Here's a cross section of a leaf. So it's kind of like zoomed in zoomed out, and this includes the midrib. And what I want to show you here is all of these collenchyma cells. Remember, those are the cells that provide structural supports. There's lots and lots of collenchyma cells that help provide some of that springy, flexible support for the leaf petiole. This is a fun example of a drought-adapted or a leaf cross section from a drought-adapted plant. In this case, Nerium oleander. And you see, so imagine what internal changes you might see, or sorry, anatomical changes you might see if you lived in a really hot and arid environment. One, you see a very thick cuticle. Look how waxy that is. You see an epidermis that's several layers deep. Much less chlorophyll, so that way you can allow light to pass through them and reach the palisade parenchyma or the palisade mesophyll. The spongy mesophyll is also quite deep, thick. But one of the really cool feature is this called an invaginated stomata. So there's a pit essentially in the bottom of the leaf, and at the very middle of that pit is the stomata with the two guard cells. So that is where carbon dioxide enters and water evaporates out of for transpiration. The idea is, one, you're still on the bottom, like here, so less direct sunlight, less evaporation. But by being in this pit, as water evaporates, it kind of bounces around in this area temporarily. And so at any given point, this area is slightly more humid, essentially, than the outside air. And when it's more humid, water evaporates less quickly. So that's one example of one of many adaptations that some plants have to arid conditions. There's also some metabolic differences too in some of these species that we will not cover. But if you're curious, look up C4 photosynthesis, as in the letter C, the number 4, or look up CAM, C-A-M photosynthesis, for really cool differences in metabolic pathways to reduce water loss in photosynthesis. All right, now on to other patterns in leaves. And one of the first questions you should ask yourself when you look at a plant to identify what it is to ask, is it a simple leaf or a compound leaf? That is, does it consist of a single continuous leaf blade, or is that leaf blade subdivided into smaller units? So simple leaf means it's a single continuous leaf blade. If it's compound, the photosynthetic surface of that leaf is subdivided into smaller leaflets. But fundamentally, it's still a single leaf. How you define a compound, or how you define a leaf to make sure you're not looking at a leaf and not a leaflet, is look for an axillary bud. So true leaves will have an axillary bud at their base. Leaflets will not. So you'll never find if there were buds here, those would be multiple simple leaves. But because there's a bud here and not at the base of these structures, then it is considered a compound leaf. Within compound leaves, there are two categories. Is it pinnately compound or is it palmately compound? Pinnate comes from the Latin word for feather. So a pinnately compound leaf has leaflets arranged along an axis. So you see they're arranged along a line. So there's leaflet, leaflet, etc. And then a palmate compound leaf, all the leaflets are arranged around a point instead of a line, like the fingers around the palm of your hand. So simple leaves are the most common, pinnately compound leaves less so, and palmately compound leaves the least so. Off the top of my head, an example of a simple leaf would be, look around, an oak leaf has a simple leaf. It may have lobes on it, but it's still a single simple leaf. For a pinnately compound leaf, imagine something like mimosa. We'll see that in a second. That's actually twice compound. But mimosa or some what's the one I'm thinking of? Some legumes will have, other legumes will have, I'm thinking of this herbaceous weed and I can't think the name of. Clover also technically has a pinnately compound leaf, but it's a specialized one called trifoliolate. We'll see in a second. Palmately compound, the best example in North Carolina would be the buckeyes. So I'll show you that in a second. But buckeye has a palmately compound leaf quite conspicuously. Instead of a mid-vein, the term for the attachment point of the leaflets is called a rachis. And for the leaflets, they have little petioles so they're called petioles. If you can pronounce that, let me know. And then they can also have stipule-like structures at the base, in which case they're called stipules instead of stipules, but they will never have buds. That will make it not a compound leaf. Oh, wait, I have examples. I meant to do that. So here's persimmon, Angiosperms virginiana. Notice that we can see a single leaf blade, a single petiole, and a bud. Here's a leaf blade, petiole, bud. Blade, petiole, bud. So those are all simple leaves. Here's an example of Spoulanthus. That is, what's it called, barefoot or something, but it's in the aster family. Same idea. Notice the leaves are arranged differently, but the pattern still holds. This is a single leaf. It has lobes and sinuses, but it's still considered a single leaf. Sure, it's not an emergency, sorry. And then at the base of the leaf, the buds have already opened. And in this case, the buds have turned into another stem with more leaves on it. But the same idea applies. There would be lateral buds in these oppositely arranged leaves. Examples of pinnately compound leaves include things like this is winged sumac. This is black walnut. Notice that here are the leaflets. There are no buds here. I should have showed you, but there would be a bud at the base of this leaf. There would be a bud at the base of this leaf. I didn't choose my pictures as well as I thought. You can almost see a bud here, but the point is there's no buds at the base of these leaflets. Now, what's different between these two pinnately compound leaf types is if they have a terminal leaflet or not. So it'd be more correct to call a pinnately compound leaf that has a single leaf at the tip oddly pinnate, because there's an odd number of leaflets, 2, 4, 6, 7. If it lacks a terminal leaflet, it's said to be evenly pinnate because there's an even number of leaflets, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 leaflets here. And there's also fancy botanical terms for this. So parapinnate just means evenly pinnate. Imparapinnate means not evenly pinnate or oddly pinnate. But compounding can happen several times over. A bipinnate leaf has leaflets that are subdivided into smaller leaflets. So this entire structure here is a single leaf. It's been subdivided once here and then again into individual leaflets. So bipinnate. Yeah, here's Buckeye. This is, oops, sorry about the error there. This is Aesclepiadia, red Buckeye. And it's a very common shrubby plant we see in our, no, this is hang on, calculating. Yeah, this is more of a tree, yeah, kind of a subshrub or a tree. Anyway, it's got compound leaves. Here's a single leaf with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 leaflets. Here's the petiole, long petiole. Here's one bud. There's another leaf right at the same node with a bud, petiole, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 leaflets. Schefflera, which is a common house plant, also has prominently palmately compound leaves. You've seen that before. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 leaflets here. There is a special term for when compound leaves have just 3 leaflets. It's trifoliolate, not trifoliate. So if you want to impress a botanist at a cocktail party, you'll use the word trifoliolate, not trifoliate. I was told by important people that know these things that trifoliate would literally mean 3 leaves on the entire plant. So do me proud, say trifoliolate. So this is oxalis, which has 1, 2, 3 leaflets, trifoliate compound leaf. Poison ivy is also well known for this too, 1, 2, 3 leaflets on a single trifoliolate compound leaf. So after you determine if it's a simple or compound leaf, look at how the leaves are arranged on the stem. The default and not default, but I would say the most common arrangement is defined as an alternate pattern. And phyllotaxy generally is a function of the number of leaflets at any given point on the node. So in the most common and the ultimate arrangement, at any one point along the stem, there's only 1 leaf. Typically, this occurs in kind of a helical pattern, or roughly so, but not always. And contrast that to the less common opposite leaf arrangement, where there are 1, 2 leaves at any one node. And a common configuration of opposite, the pairs of leaves are arranged at 90 degrees from each other. That's called the decussate pattern, but it's still fundamentally opposite. And the least common arrangement is the world arrangement, where there's more than 2 leaves per node, typically 3 or 4. So alternate is most common. We saw that with here with persimmon. So you see how they're alternately arranged. There's only 1 leaf at any one point along the stem. Whereas with small anthus here, there's 1, 2 leaves per node. It has an opposite arrangement. Similarly, with buckeye here, was a 1 leaf here, 1 leaf here, both at the same point. So we would say that these leaves are oppositely arranged. Least common is the world, and what in terms of what's local that does this is the catalpa tree, Catalpa speciosa, catalpa is what it's called. That's a good example of a world arrangement. Oh, I have more of this. Good. Okay, so another just continuous examples of alternate arrangement. This is from American elm. Here's the stem. Here are the leaves. At any one point along the stem, there's only 1 leaf. And would you define this as a simple leaf or a compound leaf? Well, we can find the darn buds just barely. There's a bud, there's a bud, there's a bud. So we would say this is definitely simple leaves arranged alternately. Oh, more examples of opposite leaf arrangements. There tend to be specific families that are well known for having opposite leaves. Among them is the olive family, which includes ashes. So Fraxinus americana here, American ash. No, what is that called? Anyway, but the Fraxinus americana is the name, is the real name. Damn it. It's the Latin name, is the real name. But you'll see in the case of, in this instance, there's a 1 leaf here, 1 leaf here, and they're each oppositely arranged. And would you call this a simple leaf or a compound leaf? If you look closely, there are no buds here, but there are buds at the base of the petiole. So we would say this is an oppositely arranged compound leaves. This is, God, I'm forgetting all my common names today. Stellaria media. Good Lord. I'll think of it in a second. Very common weed. No, I'm going to ask my phone. Sorry. Stellaria media is, and everyone's laughing at me now because I can't remember the name of this stupid weed. Chickweed. Wow, that's impressive, man. It's like Monday, part 2. Anyway, so this is chickweed, and you can see there's a pair of leaves here. Right below that, there's another pair of leaves. So they're definitely simple leaves that are oppositely arranged. Many in the mint family also have opposite arrangements. So this is Lamium purpureum. Nettle, is that, yeah. And so they typically always have opposite leaves. Mint family members also tend to have square-shaped stems. So you can roll them in their fingers and it will feel like there are 4 distinct sides. Dogwoods also have opposite leaves. Buckeyes, as I mentioned, ashes, mints. Yeah, those are kind of some viburnums and elderberry, maples. All of those will have opposite leaves. Not many examples of whorl leaves locally, but if you think of one, let me know. This is from the catalpa tree in the Bignoniaceae. And you can see at this node, there's 1, 2, 3 leaves attached at one point. And when the leaves fall off, they leave really dramatic leaf scars, which are kind of distinctive too. Here they have, they're simple leaves. There's a remnant, there's a bud there, there's a bud there. There should be a bud there. Simple whorled arrangement of catalpa. Leaves can also be described based on the overall shape of the blade. And there are many, many ways to describe it, but I'll highlight a few important examples here. The names themselves often are descriptive, so take them literally. A linear leaf is going to be thin and narrow. An elliptic leaf is going to be oval shaped. Contrast that to, say, an oblong leaf. What do you see as the difference here? In an oblong leaf, the sides are straight. In the case of an elliptic leaf, they're still curving. And then compare an elliptic leaf to a lanceolate leaf. Think of a lance or a spear, so it's a spear tip shaped leaf. Notice that with the elliptic leaf, it's symmetrical in this plane and this plane in the middle of the leaf. Here, it is not symmetrical in this plane, so it tends to be wider at the base, slightly wider at the base. Contrast that to an ovate leaf, and the root word here is not oval, it's actually ovum for egg. So an ovate leaf is egg-shaped, so it's quite dramatically wider at the base and a less pronounced narrowing at the tip. Lanceolate is going to be narrow overall and a rather abrupt. Yeah, the widest point is going to be even lower in a lanceolate leaf than it is an ovate leaf. Then the prefix ob means reversed or upside down. So ob ovate means an upside down egg-shaped leaf. Ob lanceolate would mean an upside down lance-shaped leaf, etc. Other terms to be aware of, deltate just means it's triangular, so there's a very flat bottom and flat base. So it's shaped like the Greek letter delta. Some plants like junipers, for example, can have both scale-like and awl-like leaves. So look very closely at an eastern red cedar, which again is actually a juniper, and you'll see a bunch of very tiny overlapping leaves that are shaped like scales. Then on more juvenile foliage, you might find them more shaped like a tiny awl, which is like a tool for awling things, I guess. Look up awl if you're not familiar with it. Then some plants have needle-shaped leaves, so they're just really thin and kind of quasi-round, not entirely round. They're kind of flat on one side, but many in the pine family have needle-shaped leaves, including true cedars, larches, and pines themselves. In the case of pines, what you're looking at is actually a very short stem. And those where you have 3 leaves bundled together onto one really short stem, and that's called a fascicle. And with pines, sometimes the number of needles per fascicle can help you distinguish some pines from the other. So, for example, loblolly and longleaf pines have 3 needles per fascicle. And then eastern white pine, Pinus strobus has 5 per fascicle. And then things like Pinus I should know this, I'm terrible. Like Table Mountain pine will have 2 leaves per node, and twisted, a little bit twisted. Here's just another depiction to clarify some of those points I mentioned. Ovate, wider near the base. Obovate, wider near the top. Elliptic, widest in the center. Oblong, the sides are parallel or straight compared to the curves you would see in an elliptic leaf. Here's some examples. These are some ovate leaves in pawpaw. So you see how obovate rather. You see how it gets wider at the tip. This might be borderline oblanceolate, and it's not uncommon to see multiple terms to describe a leaf too, I should say. On a given plant, there can be variability in leaf shape. So sometimes for a description, you might see obovate to oblanceolate or obovate to elliptic, and both of those can theoretically be true. The classic example of a deltoid leaf is on cottonwood. This is Populus deltoides. So you see a mostly flat base, and the overall shape of the leaf is kind of triangular or deltoid, a delta shape. Oh, wait, but there's more. There's even terms to describe the tips and bases of leaves. Some of these terms are probably self-explanatory if you remember the 9th grade geometry. Acute means something that's less than 90 degrees. Obtuse, more than 90 degrees. There can be other simple ones like rounded, so it's simply semicircular at the tip. Truncate means it's kind of cut off. These others may be a bit more confusing. So retuse means it's slightly notched. Emarginate means it's dramatically notched and might even look like, the shape of some, yeah, your body part of choice, I guess. But we see kind of two dramatic, not lobes, but two protrusions at the tip. Very deep cleft, in other words. And then there's attenuate, which means a very gradual inward or concave curve to the tip. Contrast that to acuminate, where it's a more abrupt tip. And then mucrinate, there's just sort of a very, very, it's like micro acuminate. So there can be like just a little pin or extension of the vein called a mucro. And many of the similar terms apply to the bases of the leaves too. So acute and obtuse, rounded, truncate. Decurrent is kind of the base version of attenuate. And then if the bottom of the leaf is more shaped like the top of a heart, it's said to be a chordate base. So a good example here would be redbud. And then sagittate refers to kind of an arrowhead shape. Think Sagittarius, for example. I would make an astrology joke, but I'll resist. And then cuneate, if it helps you remember cuneiform, ancient Mesopotamian writing system using wedges in clay. So cuneate means wedge shaped. And really yeah, this is, I have another image that I should have another image, but it's more clearly like narrower than you would see in an acute angle. Oh, wait, there's more. There's even terms to describe the margins or the outer edges of leaves. And if a leaf is smooth on the edge, there's no teeth, it's not called smooth. That'd be too easy. It's said to be entire. And then there are different kinds of teeth. So a common type is a serrated margin. And in serrated margins, the teeth basically point towards the tip. Contrast that to dentate margins, where the points of the teeth point outward and away from the leaf. So this is like a serrated knife. These are more like shark's teeth. And then there can be diminutives attached to terms. So denticulate, so ulate means tiny. So little shark's teeth is denticulate. Crenate means like semicircles, so they're not sharp. They're just kind of like if you're drawing a cloud as a child, just like half circles on the edge. And crenulate in that case would mean smaller half circles. And then undulate and sinuate on this drawing look similar, but they are different. And they refer to in which dimension the leaf margin is wavy. So in an undulate margin, it's wavy in the same dimension as the screen in this direction. In a sinuate margin, they're wavy in the perpendicular direction. So if you're looking at my hand, they're wavy in this direction, up and down, so perpendicular to the laminar surface. The lamina, whatever. Here, so here are some examples. This is from river birch, Betula nigra, and this is actually doubly serrate. So you see these serrate teeth pointed towards the tip, but those teeth also have teeth, so it's doubly serrate, and those teeth are also serrated in shape. Here's the entire margin of dogwood, flowering dogwood or native dogwood. So no teeth at all, so it has an entire margin. Notice with the river birch, they have alternate leaves. The leaf shape is, I don't know, how would you describe that? Kind of ovate with a obtuse base, maybe an attenuate tip. And the veins, notice they go all the way to the edge of the leaf margin. Contrast that to dogwood, which you might be able to see here, has opposite leaves. A again, kind of an attenuate leaf tip, maybe more of a obtuse to rounded leaf base. And notice the different pattern of the leaf veins. They're curving not entirely to the edge, but they curve back towards the tip and they start to connect with each other. So anyway, those are the sorts of features you would start to look at when you try and identify a species. So these leaves you looked at so far are said to be unlobed. They might have teeth, but if there are very dramatic protrusions and extrusions, or the same thing, I don't know. They're said to be lobed. So if you imagine like a white oak leaf, or even a red oak leaf, a single leaf, it's going to have these protrusions that are called lobes. And in between the protrusions are areas called sinuses. So looking at see if a leaf is lobed or unlobed is helpful. Now, there are technically, if you check the literature, specific ways to describe the degree of lobing. And so I left this here just for reference, but technically, if it's just if the sinus only goes up to a quarter way towards the center of the leaf, it's said to be lobed. If it's a fourth to a half, it's said to be cleft. A half to 3/4 said to be parted, and if it goes almost all the way to the mid vein, it's said to be divided. So compare, let's say, the lobes of a red maple, and our native red maple. Oh, I have, wait, I read my own mind. Watch this. Whoa. Okay, so compare the lobes of our native red maple, which you might define, let's say, what would you call that? A quarter to half. So we'd probably call that, I don't know, somewhere between lobed and cleft, palmately so, right? Compare that to a cultivar of Japanese maple, where they're very clearly divided. Oh, I said parted here. And see how deep those divisions go all the way to the base of the leaf. There's a lot. Well, I will actually. So you can also look at leaf veins in some cases to help distinguish them. So the secondary veins can differ. Sometimes they are pinnately netted. Other times, in lobes, there can be multiple primary veins. So the palmately netted. And as I mentioned, with monocots like grasses and irises and orchids, the main veins occur in parallel. And you won't have to know any of this, but just know that there's lots of ways botanists can describe that in pattern of veins, and they've got some fabulous names, like Craspedodromus or semi-Craspedodromus. Isn't that awesome? So please make use of these at cocktail parties, and know that few people are more pretentious than botanists when it comes to this thing. So, you've earned it. You can show off. Go for it. Anyway, so this is just, if you want to read about these, you can. But there are terms to describe these different leaf patterns. And if you have any questions about them, I'll be glad to explain. Same thing for in a more palmate pattern. Here's some Craspedodromus veins of Fagus grandifolia. So this is American beech. So they're Craspedodromus. I guess I'm going over this after all, in that the veins go all the way to the edge. So you see that the veins go all the way to the very edge. And then in Camptodromus leaves, they don't go all the way to the margin. They start to curve and or reattach before they get to the margin, like in the case, again, with flowering dogwood. Are we having fun yet? Because do you know leaves and plant parts have hairs? Oh, they do. The hairs are often extensions of cell walls, or they can be several cells in size. No, so they're almost always cellular in themselves. I take that back. And the presence or absence of hairs is described as pubescence. So giggle to yourself if you want. But there are different ways to describe pubescence, and you won't need to know these, but just know there's different terms here. Like So generally hairy is pubescent. If say if the hairs are densely matted together, they're said to be tomentose. If they're densely matted and short, it's tomentulose. Let's see what else. Hirsute is kind of long and stiff hairs. What's another fun one? Scabrous means they're kind of rough to touch, kind of sandpapery, etc. So this describes the overall vestiture, the overall arrangement of leaf hairs. So some examples, a really good example actually is comparing two of our native hickory species, which have very perfectly appropriate specific epithets. So Caria tomentosa has tomentose hairs on the underside of the leaves and the petioles. And so if you find a hickory that's got a pinnately compound leaf, and you can feel lots of hairs, and typically 5 to 7 leaflets, lots of hairs that vary from white to kind of yellow, or white hairs that look yellow because the petiole is yellow, then it's a good chance it's Caria tomentosa, which is mockernut hickory. And then if something is hairless, it's said to be glabrous. Again, why say hairless when you can say glabrous? In this case, the pignut hickory, Caria glabra, lacks those hairs. So in there, depending on how you approach the key, depending what other species you're looking at, this can be one way to distinguish these two species. And then the individual hairs can be more elaborate. Instead of being, extensions of cell walls, they can be themselves several cells in size. Those are described as trichomes. And just a few to look at, like a glandular hair will have the tip with a sac of usually aromatic oils in it. A stellate hair is star-shaped. A peltate hair has a flat surface on top, etc., etc. So some examples that are kind of local and interesting might be the stellate trichomes of Quercus stellata. This is post oak. So if you look on the underside, mainly the underside, but also some of the top of post oak, you have these hairs that have this star shape, and that's where it gets its specific epithet that names the species. This is a salvia species. It's a European species, but you can see salvia is sage, type of sage, and they're very aromatic and they have these kind of short glandular hairs. And when you crush the leaves, you're breaking open this this cell at the tip that releases those aromatic oils. There's also terms for sharp, pointy things, and sharp, pointy things on plants vary in their name based on what tissue they're derived from, what they're modified from. So if they are modified leaves or stipules based on where they're appearing on the plant, they are said to be spines. If they're a modified stem, they're called a thorn. And if they're modified epidermal tissue, they're called prickles. Spines are pretty common, thorns less so, prickles are quite common, and every rose has its prickle. So what you see in the rose family are often prickles. So look at the arrangement of these spiny things on these sharp and pointy things on the stem. Is it occurring where a stem should be or where a leaf or stipule should be? If it's more randomly placed, it's probably a prickle, because those are just extensions of the epidermal cells or the epidermal tissue system. And so they'll be much more randomly placed. Also, prickles are often easier to break off. Like if you go to, this is a blackberry, I think. If you can just snap off the prickles pretty easily with the thumb. Whereas with thorns and spines, are going to be a lot harder to do that. Notice too with prickles how they kind of gradually extend naturally from the epidermis, because they're just an extension of the epidermis. Whereas with thorns and spines, they're pretty distinctive compared to the rest of the stem, right? So leaves can be modified into all sorts of different functions. Modified leaves, modified a leaf at the base of a flower can be called a bract. You can make the case that all of the parts of a leaf are developmentally kind of modified leaves and stems, but the most leafy-like part of the flower that we'll learn in the next lecture is called the calyx, collectively made up of individual sepals. Leaves can be modified into traps, like with the Venus flytrap. Leaves can be modified into tendrils. This is a leaflet tendril, but leaf tendrils can also be modified stems. And then, as you'd see with if you imagine a flower that's closed and bud, the sepals act to protect the leaf. And on woody plants, the buds are surrounded by bud scales, which are also sort of like modified leaves. And then some leaves can be modified into storage tissue. So in the case of like onions and garlic, those are just heavily modified leaves that happen to be underground. Okay, on to stems. Stems function as a place to mount leaves, right? That's where, and by growing vertically, you can conceivably try to compete with your neighbors to get better access to sunlight. As I mentioned before, the pattern of a stem is called a phytomere, and it tends to be a repeating combination of a leaf, axillary bud, and the internodal space. So leaf, axillary bud, internodal space, so node, internode, etc. They also, a major function of the stem is also to help transport food and water to and from the leaves to the rest of the plant and vice versa. I alluded to it earlier, but I'll mention it again just to make sure we're clear here. Yeah, within the vascular tissue occurs in stems, it occurs in leaves, it occurs in roots, it occurs in flowers, but we'll talk about it here because that's what I want to do. So there are two kinds of vascular cells, xylem and phloem. Xylem cells conduct water. It's a one-way process through transpiration. It goes from the roots to the trunk, to the stem, to the leaves, into the atmosphere. And that's done through transpiration. So that requires no energy input from the plant. And then phloem cells are what move the food made in photosynthesis from where it's made to where it's needed. And therefore, that can go in any direction potentially. However, this does work through another mechanism called the pressure flow hypothesis, and that does require energetic input from the plants to move food around. Again, just to emphasize this to make sure we're clear here, because this is kind of an important concept. The xylem and phloem cells are arranged in bundles in ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. In the case of gymnosperms and many angiosperms, these bundles are arranged in a ring pattern when the stem is young. Within a given bundle, there are phloem cells on the outside in red here, xylem cells on the inside, and in between is the vascular cambium that divides to produce more phloem in this direction and more xylem in this direction. The result is, as those cells continue to divide, the overall girth of the stem increases, and that is called secondary growth. So old xylem, especially in woody plants, will keep accumulating towards the center, and then younger xylem will be formed towards the outside, not entirely, because to the outside of that part of the stem, I guess. And then in the case of the phloem, because the stem is growing in girth, whatever is on the outside is going to be shed, means ruptured and shed. So as the stem matures, you're going to get a thin layer of phloem cells, a very thin layer of vascular cambium, and a thick layer of xylem. So if you do a cross-section of a woody plant, you'll see the differences in this tissue. So in woody plants, the wood is referring specifically to xylem cells. And often in a timber or lumber context, we distinguish between the hardwood and sapwood. So the hardwood is at the centermost of a woody plant, and those are typically those are always the oldest xylem cells, and those are typically non-functional at maturity. It's the hardwood that's still the sapwood that's still actively involved in transporting water. Just beyond the sapwood is the vascular cambium, which makes more xylem this way, more phloem this way. And then we get these extra layers in addition to the phloem on woody plants. There's extra layers called the periderm that make up cork and cork cambium. And combined with the living phloem, shed old phloem and accumulating periderm is what we call bark. And that is just meant to be continuously ruptured and shed. And that layer is to protect the delicate tissues beneath the bark. Because if you were to damage tissues beyond the bark, let's say you destroy by girdling all of the phloem, then there's no way for the plant to transport the foods made in photosynthesis down to the roots. The roots will die because they can't photosynthesize because they're underground. Likewise, girdling will also destroy the vascular cambium. So there's no way to generate more phloem. Now, in many cases, damage down to the sapwood can be compensated for by phloem that's working in other parts of the trunk. But if you were to completely and circularly remove by girdling that entire phloem later, the plant will die. Bark will also have ruptures in it called lenticels that allow better oxygen exchange to all this living tissue beneath all that thick bark. All woody plants have lenticels, but they're just not obvious in a lot of cases. If you imagine a cherry tree, those horizontal bands you see in a young trunk, those are examples of lenticels, and those are for helping with gas exchange, oxygen getting to those living tissues beneath more efficiently. Stems can also be modified into specialized structures. So sometimes they can be above ground or below ground, but either way modified for storing starches. So if it's a swollen stem that's above ground and it has a thin papery covering called a tunica, I think, it's said to be a corm, right? Like in gladiolus. Kohlrabi is example, just a straight up storage stem, just a swollen base. They store starches there. And then if it's an underground swollen stem for storage, it's called a tuber. So in the case of white potatoes, Irish potatoes, which are not from Ireland, but from Peru, but those are modified stems, and you can tell that they are modified stems because of the eyes on a potato. Those are just stem buds, and if you let them grow, they become new stems. It's just like you would find lateral stems on a normal stem. In other cases, stems can be modified into tendril, just like leaves can be modified tendrils. In the grape family, the tendrils you see tend to be modified stems. And then there are two kinds of horizontal stems, some of which grow underground, some of which grow above ground. If it's an underground horizontal stem, it's called a rhizome, as you would see on iris. With a horizontal stem, the idea is that a plant can vegetatively spread over a larger area quickly. So it will produce horizontal shoots, and then after a certain distance, will produce new vertical shoots with leaves. And if that horizontal shoot is above ground, it's called a stolon. So like with strawberry. With some grasses like Bermuda grass, they have both rhizomes and stolons. So they have both above ground and below ground stems, which make them very prone to spreading. Anyone that has Bermuda knows, so has to mow it twice a week. Okay, finally, we'll finish with a few slides on roots. Roots are what anchor the plant into the ground and are the organs that absorb water from the soil. And water interacts with soil and it dissolves nutrients in that soil. So that's also the means by which plants take up nutrients. And remember, nutrients are different than food. Food is made in photosynthesis. Nutrients are chemicals that plants use in smaller concentrations for certain biochemical or structural reasons, like nitrogen for making amino acids that make protein, or potassium for regulating cell osmolarity, etc. Root tips have some special structures. So really young roots that are exploring the soil will have features that enable them to more easily navigate or penetrate through soil particles. One of which is something called a root cap, and this is a region where cells are rapidly dividing just for the purposes of shedding. And in addition to that, they'll also produce a mucilage compound, and both of these effectively act to help lubricate the root tip through the soil medium. Root tips also have extensions on individual cells called root hairs, and these greatly increase the surface area of the root tip, so they can absorb a lot more water and nutrients than just a single cylinder of a root tip would. For many woody plants, the underground structure of the roots is different than you might normally conceive of. So there's a misunderstanding that the structure of the root mass mirrors the canopy, the above ground portions of, say, a tree or a shrub. That's not the case. Now, there could be a similar ratio of mass, but not necessarily. But in reality, there's not usually some giant, massive taproot that's going down to the center of the Earth's core. Really, roots of, say, trees and shrubs go out far broader and are not as deep as you might imagine. It's the feeder roots at the tips that tend to be most active in nutrient absorption, but they also absorb water. They direct whatever they absorb down to the older transport roots that eventually merge into the anchor roots. And the anchor roots mostly absorb water. They don't really absorb nutrients. So applying fertilizer at the base of a tree trunk ain't going to do you much good. So typically the roots will extend at least to the drip line, which is this imaginary line that you draw at the tip of the canopy, but often they're far beyond that. Notice too that they're relatively superficial. They grow in the first, several feet of the soil profile, because when it rains, that's where the water is going to go first, and there could be lots of competition potentially. But in some cases, there are trees that have deeper tap roots for accessing deeper water stored in above an impervious rock layer or something. Roots can also be modified into different functions. So they're, in the case of mangroves, like white mangroves, red mangroves, black mangroves, they have structures called pneumatophores, which are extensions of the roots that are in the water that enable the more oxygen exchange to the roots, because the roots need oxygen too to live. Other aquatic plants have other adaptations for that, but this is how the pneumatophores are how mangroves deal with it. Orchids can have structures called aerial roots, because many orchids are epiphytes, so they grow on other plants, and they have special tissue layers that allow them to absorb water from the humid air quite efficiently. And then roots can also be modified, kind of like stems, into energy storage, like in the case of sweet potato. So notice here, sweet potato, which is a type of morning glory, it has a storage root instead of a tuber. And on a sweet potato, you'll never find eyes, really. So you won't find buds because it's not a stem, it's a root. Okay, finally, just some general definitions to make sure you're aware of them if you come across these. On plant duration and plant habit or growth form. So we distinguish between annual, biennial, and perennial plants based on the frequency of their life cycle. So an annual plant, as the name implies, means it tends to complete its life cycle in 1 year. So it will go from seed to seed in 1 calendar year, or within 365 days or so. And often these in the temperate areas, these tend to be defined as either cool season or warm season annuals. And a cool season annual will tend to germinate in the late summer, flower in winter or spring, and be dead by summer. Whereas a warm season annual will not emerge until it starts to warm up in spring, flower in the summer, set fruit and seed in the fall, and be dead by cold temperatures in winter. So things like Houstonia, a common small plant here, or Biden's aristosa, those are both annuals. This one's native. Then a biennial, like in some thistles, for example, as one example, they complete their life cycle in 2 years. And in many environments, that means the first year they just grow a bunch of leaves, and they use all those leaves to try to save up a lot of stored energy in order for the following year to reproduce and make flowers and fruits and seeds. In our environment, like in the Southeast, it's warm enough for long enough that many biennials can behave as annuals. We have a long enough growing season that they can go and flower in the same year. But in north of us, that's less go. So then perennial plants are plants that live, at least some part of them live for several years, or sometimes many years. And perennial plants can either be herbaceous or woody. In a purely herbaceous perennial, the above ground portion will die back each year, but the below ground root systems and the crown will live for many years. And each spring, new non-woody growth will emerge from the crown and from the roots, or from a tuber or something, like in place of Claytonia here, spring beauty. And then woody plants are those that persist for many, where the above ground portions live for many years. So they don't die back. They can go dormant in the case of deciduous woody plants, deciduous trees and shrubs. But evergreens will keep their leaves, for example. But that superstructure where the leaves are mounted will stay above ground for many years until time or disease or something eventually takes its toll. And then to clarify too, oh, did I get something? No, I didn't. Okay. So again, herbaceous does not mean it's just used to flavor your food. So an herb, herbaceous means the main plant body is not woody. It's fleshy, flexible, and it could be an annual herbaceous, or it could be biennial, or it could be perennial, as I mentioned. So like Carolina geranium is a herbaceous, herbaceous annual. And then Baptisia would be an example of a herbaceous perennial. So the below ground portion still lives, but the top dies back. And then one way to get to kind of the halfway point sort of is not to be so rigid as to be upright entirely, where you take advantage of other plants or other things to grow on, and don't waste your energy on growing super tall yourself. And those are what vines and lianas do. So if it's most correct to consider a herbaceous part of a vine-like plant to be a true vine, but if it's a larger, woodier vine, it's technically described as a liana. And then there's also, for woody plants, we can distinguish between shrubs and trees. And this is also can be kind of a loose, graduating gray zone, transitionary definition. It's biology, so everything's a gray zone. But typically we call a shrub if it has multiple woody stems at the base. So in this case, there's a Yopon holly, native holly, that we would call a shrub, or maybe even something like Fothergilla, a gorgeous native shrub. So many woody stems that are distinct at the base. And a tree tends to start as a single trunk from the base and then diverge into multiple branches above that. But sometimes you can still have a multi-stem tree, kind of like with birches, for example. That's not, and in some literature, you'll see it as a large shrub to small tree, and that just reflects the variability of some of the growth forms. But still, even with this, with birches, they're often you can still tell that the multiple main trunks are still connected at the base to some degree. Okay, so that's vegetative anatomy. Next lecture will be on flower and fruit anatomy. So thank you for sticking around for that, hopefully in one go. See you shortly.